Welcome to the Well Path podcast, where we sit down with experts and entrepreneurs across fitness, nutrition, mindfulness, and spirituality, offering you an inside peek at building a business and a life that is truly aligned. I'm your host, Brooke Robbins. Let's get into it. Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Accept the place that divine providence has found for you, the society of your contemporaries, a connection of events. Great men have always done so and confided themselves childlike to the genius of their age, betraying their perception that the absolutely trustworthy was seated at their heart, working through their hands, predominating in all their being. So that first opening line of this podcast episode is one of my favorite lines, honestly, of any piece of writing. It is from the essay called Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson. This has been my favorite essay since I first read it in the 10th grade. And as I've gotten older, I've come back to that essay and reread it multiple times throughout my life. And it really is one of these pieces of art that kind of unfolds new layers of itself every single time that I come back to it. I recently was rereading this essay, just kind of felt called to actually order a new copy of it and kind of re-annotate it. And this line never ceases to stop me in my tracks. This episode is going to be about this concept of trusting yourself, this concept of choosing yourself, this concept of how to stop self-abandoning inside of relationships, inside of work contexts, inside of friendships, and just in your day-to-day life. And I want to kind of start this episode on a bit of a personal note. A little more than a year ago, I broke off an engagement, ended a 5-year-long relationship, moved continents, and basically turned my entire life upside down. And so rereading this essay actually over the last couple of weeks, it kind of caused me to stop and just realize how much of my journey over the last year has been about coming home to myself, coming home to a higher power, and learning to truly embody that feeling of self-trust. So again, this episode is really about reclaiming that iron string that Ralph Waldo Emerson talks about, that sense of intuition that lives within each of us, which is the core, the unshakable foundation of self-trust. And it's really about taking radical accountability for the ways in which we have participated in our own abandonment. It is only through awareness that we can actually change anything about our lives. So this episode is meant to be a bit of a mirror. We're going to talk about why self-reliance matters and what it means. We're going to talk about what self-abandonment is and what it can look like, and some of the sneaky kind of faces of self-abandonment. And then we're going to talk about tactical tips that you can take into your week to start to rewire this in your own life so that you can become the best version of you, which is our goal every single episode. So to start things off, I want to talk about this concept of self-reliance. I saw a quote recently and it really stopped me in my tracks, and I'm ad-libbing a little bit because I can't find the original kind of post, but the idea was, if you abandon yourself in private, you'll find yourself chasing people who abandon you in public. If you choose yourself in private, you'll attract people who claim you loudly and proudly. And if hearing that made you feel some type of way, maybe based on like your relationship history or things that have happened in your life, you're not alone. But just sit with those words for a second, because at the core of this statement is this fundamental truth that ultimately you set the standard for how other people are allowed to treat you based on how you treat yourself. And so that extends to everything. So again, it's like if you're self-abandoning, you're abandoning yourself in the private of your own mind, in the private of your own heart and soul, then it only makes sense that you are going to attract and ultimately enable people that are going to abandon you publicly and externally. Everything that shows up in our external reality is a reflection of what's going on internally. On the contrary, when you learn to choose yourself in private, when you learn to stand up for yourself, when you learn to honor yourself, your body, your mind, your soul, your needs, your truth, you attract people who claim that and who are proud of it and who stand up for you in turn, right? And so there's a little bit of a conversation we need to have about the energetics of self-abandonment and this idea that, again, how we treat ourselves does ultimately set the tone for what we expect and also what we accept from others. So as within, so without, right? And that is the case with everything in life. This is where, and we've done a couple of episodes that have touched on this topic as well. One of my other favorite topics, which is related, is the concept of radical accountability, which is to say that everything that happens in your life, everything that shows up in your life, the common denominator is always you. And it can be uncomfortable to think about things from that lens, but you can kind of turn it on its head and realize that it's a very empowering way to live. That, again, everything that's showing up for you externally is in some way, shape, or form a reflection of what's going on for you internally. It gives you a lot of power because ultimately the only thing you have control over, actually, in a direct way, is the internal, is your own self, your own reactions to things, your own belief systems, all of that. And when we talk about self-abandonment, I think it's going to be important to give examples because sometimes self-abandonment can be very sneaky. It doesn't always announce itself when it walks into the room, right? It can look like a lot of different things, but it's something that can show up, equally in like dating and relationships, but also in friendships, family dynamics, work settings. And one thing that I've definitely noticed is that, again, because everything is a reflection from within, gets reflected externally, is all of these things are usually happening in tandem. So if you're somebody who struggles to set boundaries in relationships, you probably also struggle to set boundaries with your family, with your friends, with your work. And if you're somebody who has a really strong foundation of self-trust, self-love, of self-worth, then it's very likely that you're able to set boundaries and set standards for yourself across all categories of your life. And so a couple of different ways that this can show up, or maybe showing up in your life, is a tendency to chase people who are hot and cold, a tendency to relinquish your own goals or your own happiness in order to keep peace with somebody else or some other people. It can look like constantly second guessing yourself, asking for a million opinions on things, not trusting your own gut instincts, not trusting your own opinions on what's the right path forward for you, second guessing your worth, or overly associating your worth with some sort of external validation. These are all signs of some sort of struggle with internal self-worth and self-trust. And when it comes to self-abandonment, a couple of different ways that this can look. It can look like setting a boundary and then walking it back when it creates friction. So like, if you're listening to this, have you ever been, whether it's in a relationship, in a friendship, or in a job context, have you ever stated something as a need? And then when the person in question couldn't or wouldn't meet that need, rather than walking away, did you walk the need back, right? And again, this could be in relationships, this could be in a family dynamic, it could be in a friendship, it could be in a work situation. So I'd say actually level 1 would be not setting boundaries at all. Level 2 of self-abandonment is you set the boundary and you state the need. And then when it doesn't get met, rather than walking away, you walk the need back. That is a form of self-abandonment. And it's actually a really, really taxing form of self-abandonment. And it's one that will build up over time. So even if it's a minor thing, right, it may seem like not a big deal at the time, but over time, consciously or subconsciously, this is eroding your own self-worth. You're losing trust in yourself to actually be able to stick to what you have said that you needed. Number 2, saying yes when your body is saying no. Do you have a tendency to say yes to things out of guilt, obligation, or even a feeling of FOMO, even when your intuition is begging you to say no? I am definitely guilty of this. It's something I am actively working on. I think, and again, these are kind of different things, but it can show up as in a couple different ways. One is like saying yes to things, whether it's like social plans, invitations, opportunities, whatever, because you feel like some sort of obligation, some sort of guilt to do so, even when you know that it's not, what you need, what your body needs, what your energy needs at that moment. Sometimes it's a FOMO thing. And FOMO is a really interesting topic. I'll probably do a totally, like, entirely separate episode on the concept of FOMO at some point, because yeah, I think it's an important one. FOMO being obviously the fear of missing out. That is also just another form of self-abandonment. It's like this feeling that in order to be in an in-group, you have to be, everywhere all the time, rather than just allowing yourself to show up for the things that feel right for you and trusting that, people are still going to be around. If you miss one thing here or there or the other, that your entire social standing isn't going to come down and crumble. It can also look like, and this is, I would say, something that is maybe more relevant for women, but having a tendency to be maybe like a little bit too nice, too polite. Like, for example, if somebody, asks you for your number or something and you're like not really interested, sometimes I think as women, some of us can struggle to just say no, like, I'm not interested. Thanks, though. Have a great day. You might feel pressure to give in a little bit. It's like a fear of, upsetting somebody or disappointing somebody when what you actually want to say is like, I'm not interested, but you say something else. So anytime that you say yes to something when your body, your intuition is kind of telling you that it's a no, that's a form of self-abandonment. Another one is prioritizing someone else's needs over and over again at the cost of your own peace. So I want to be really clear. This is not about one-time situations, because sometimes it is important to prioritize others over yourself or your kind of preference during times of need. Like, it's important to make sacrifices sometimes for people that you love. Like, all of that is very healthy. But what we're talking about here is a chronic pattern of self-abandonment. And if you have ever found yourself in a situation with somebody where you are consistently abandoning what you need for somebody else's benefit, time and time and time and time again, ask yourself the question, why? Why am I doing this? Right? Because when it does become a pattern and it's like a chronic thing, that is definitely a form of self-abandonment. And then the last one, and this one is super important. The last one is breaking promises to yourself. Okay. Skipping the workout that you said you'd do, hitting snooze when you promised yourself that you would get up early to meditate before you start your workday, like ignoring kind of the impulse to create or work on your passion project, not meeting your own deadlines that you set for yourself, numbing yourself instead of like nourishing yourself. And there are so many different forms that can take. Anytime that you tell yourself that you are going to do something and you renege on that, you need to start to think about it as like your relationship to yourself is way more important than your relationship to literally anybody else except for God or your higher power. And so you should take the promises that you make to yourself as intensely, if not even more intensely, than the promises that you make to others. And again, we're all human. It's okay. Like, every now and again, something happens, something comes up. But it is really, really important to habitually keep promises to yourself, because that is where an internal sense of self-worth actually comes from. And this is another topic that we could go down a whole rabbit hole, and there's probably a whole episode on this, but just the concept in general that I'll touch on quickly in this episode is like internal versus external validation. And I think a lot of times external validation can feel like internal validation. It can parade as internal validation for a moment in time, but it'll always give itself away. And anytime that you're relying on positive feedback from others to feel good about yourself, that's not actually coming from inside of you. So the question sometimes is, well, how do I build an internal sense of self-worth if I feel like I don't have it right now? And my answer to that would be the best possible way to start doing that quickly and rapidly is to start creating promises to yourself and keeping them. Start showing up for yourself behind closed doors, right? When nobody's watching, when it's just you and you. How do you show up for yourself? That is going to build such a strong foundation of self-worth and self-love, not in like the hallmark way, but in the way of like you truly, genuinely love and admire yourself so much because you see what you can do. Now, before we move on to the next section of this, I really want to actually just take a second to pause and just prompt a little bit of reflection here. As you're listening to this episode, we've gotten a little bit of the way through as we've been talking about these topics. Like, take a second to just ask yourself this question: where have I been betraying myself quietly? Just let the question land. If you need to pause the episode and let that sink in and just observe what comes up, go ahead and do that. And then we will move right on. The last thing I want to say, again, before we move on to kind of the next section of this, is all of these things can be very subtle. I'll actually share an example from like my own life, relatively recently. And this ties into the topic of FOMO, which is something that's been on my mind a lot. Is like, for example, if you don't get invited to something that you hoped to be invited to, maybe it's like whether it's a group of friends or it's like a social setting or it's a thing that you had said that you wanted to do, whatever it is. Like, if you find yourself in a situation where some people that you're friends with or friendly with are doing something and you weren't included in it, there's a low self-worth and high self-worth way to respond to that situation. The low self-worth way to respond to it is to try to prove your value to secure an invite into the in group. Okay. And this is why I'm saying it's like super sneaky, because this stuff can be very, very subconscious. Like until you've really worked to be aware of everything that you do and think and feel, this can go very much under the radar. But it's a very natural reaction to being kind of excluded from something, is to double down and try to, again, like prove that you are worthy of being there, or prove that you are valuable enough, or whatever the case may be. The high self-worth way to respond is to just lean back and use your energy to find new spaces and places where your presence is already valued and truly wanted. And I think it's really important to point this out because it really goes hand in hand. And this is where all these things are so interconnected. The same relational pattern that might have yourself finding yourself chasing people that are hot and cold with you. This is like a way that it can show up in a friendship dynamic, is like, okay, you get excluded from something, you're not included fully, maybe in something, and your reaction is to basically chase the thing rather than to say, okay, for some reason or another, I'm not included in this thing. That's okay. I have so many people in my life that truly love and want to be around me, you know? And so it's like, can you take the approach of, if I'm not being included in that thing, then it's not for me. And that's totally okay. And like, probably there's something way more aligned just around the corner that I'm just being redirected to. So I wanted to bring that up as like a little micro example. Now, moving on, again, because these topics are really interrelated, I want to take a second to just spend some time on the concept of like radical awareness. And I touched on this briefly just now, but first of all, self-abandonment is oftentimes a survival strategy that we inherited. And like, again, it's very, very subtle, but sometimes it's like, in order to, avoid displeasing or being shut out from something as a child, when like you literally can't handle that, you develop these strategies to prioritize others over yourself. And when you become an adult, it starts to become very counterproductive. And this is where like we have to start to rewire this. And when it comes to radical awareness, what I mean by that is, in life in general, it's one of the most powerful things that you can cultivate, is this sense of radical awareness where you are so aware of yourself that no thought or feeling goes unnoticed. So again, it's like, as humans, we're not perfect. It's like, even when you're doing all this work and the subconscious work and the self-worth work and you're doing all this stuff, you're definitely still going to have moments where you stumble and, you know, you have a low self-worth moment, or you struggle with something, or you feel a really intense reaction to something that you feel like you're overreacting to. That's all okay. The point of life isn't to mute your emotions and not feel things anymore. But becoming aware of them is really where the power lies, because the problem isn't in the baseline experience, right, of being a human being. It's the way that we react to all of these things. And so if you can start to become hyper aware of everything that's going on for you, you know, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, then you are able to actually choose with your own free will how you want to react to things. And that's like a really, really powerful place to be. So I'd like for everybody listening to this to take a second and just kind of like track in real time, thinking about a couple of different things. Where in your life are you moving the goalpost for someone who's not meeting your needs? Where in your life are you afraid to disappoint somebody, so you instead disappear on yourself? Do your thoughts match your words? And do your words match your actions? Where do your thoughts not match your words? And where do your words not meet your actions? And then think about why. This is going to help you start to get to the root of like what is going on. And again, none of this should be done from a point of like shaming yourself. This is very, very, very normal. This is why we're doing an episode on this, because I think that everybody struggles with this from one extent or another. And it is something that you can take control of and actively and proactively decide to change in your reactions to these things. So over the next week, start to try to develop this sense of like radical awareness of what's going on for you. I'll share a couple of journaling prompts and I'll put them in the show notes as well. But a couple of things that you can journal on in this context are, where am I still pretending not to know what I need? And where am I still chasing something that isn't choosing me? I think these are really important questions to be asking yourself. And again, this might be relationship, it might be from a friendship context, it might be in work, it could be showing up in your life in so many different ways, but it's all part of the same root. So, like I said, oftentimes when it's showing up in one place, it's probably also showing up to an extent in other places. So, less important about the context, but more about developing this awareness to be able to actually see what's going on for you and to be able to, honestly, it's like lovingly call yourself out on your own bullshit. That's kind of what it is. Now, we talked a little bit about how keeping promises to yourself is probably the best way, definitely the quickest way to build a strong internal sense of self-worth. It's a way to start practicing choosing yourself and showing yourself that you have your own back. Another thing that I always like to say to people is, in your life, it's inevitable that somebody at some point is going to abandon you, is going to betray you, is going to leave you, is not going to prioritize you, is not going to choose you. Just don't let that person be you. You cannot control anybody else and you cannot control other people's behavior, but you can control how you relate to you. And then in an indirect way, as we discussed at the beginning of this episode, how you relate to you over time will start to change the types of connections that you pull in. And that in turn will actually change your external reality of how people are treating you back to you. But again, it all starts from your relationship from you to you, your relationship with yourself and how you treat her or him. So I want to quickly take a second, again, just to differentiate, because I think internal and external self-worth, it's an important concept. And by the way, this is something that I think a lot of you guys might resonate with. So as somebody who's I have like strong Aries energy, I am very confident in a lot of ways. So a lot of the times it's like, oh, I'm super confident. I don't have a confidence issue. Like I'm super confident because externally I am very confident. But as I've delved into the radical self-awareness, I've realized that a lot of my self-worth comes from external validation, Instagram likes, compliments from people specifically like calling me out for things, accolades, achievements, awards, like all of that stuff is external validation. It's not bad. We don't have to demonize it, but that's just like one type of validation that comes from outside of you. Internal self-worth means regardless of other people's perceptions of me, how do I perceive me? Am I proud of who I am? Am I proud of how I act? Am I good with me? Very different question. And it's important to really separate them into two different categories here. So in terms of building an internal self-worth, this is why keeping promises to yourself is a really key strategy here, is because it's not about getting the validation from anybody else. It's, can I prove to myself that I can show up for me? So my challenge to everybody this week is choose 1 to 2 small but sacred commitments and keep them religiously. Make them manageable. Like make it something that you know you're going to do, because if you make a promise to yourself and don't keep it, that's going to have the opposite effect. Okay. It's going to hinder your self-worth and self-esteem. So you need to make them reasonable. For example, meditating for 10 minutes every single day, no excuses. Like no matter what happens, like you're meditating 10 minutes a day, you will find the time. Working out 4 times a week, journaling before bed every day, doing 10K steps a day. Like choose something that is important to you, but is also not like, it's not that you're going to be running 6 miles a day. Like make it reasonable so that you know that you can do it. And it is 100% non-negotiable. Like you do not give yourself a choice. This is already decided. It's been predetermined. It's not about productivity, but it's training your brain and your nervous system to trust you. You do not inherit self-trust by like listening to affirmations or even like, again, getting external validation from other people. You earn it by keeping the promises that you make to yourself. When you choose yourself consistently, you become the kind of person who doesn't need to beg for belonging. You don't need to beg to be chosen by anybody else. You don't need to shrink yourself to make other people more comfortable. You're not afraid anymore of what other people's reactions or perceptions of you might be when you show up in your authenticity, because you know that at the end of the day, you have your own back. And so, yes, is it great if other people are there too and along for the ride? We all want that. But you have such a strong sense of self that you are no longer tempted to shapeshift or morph yourself into something that you're not to keep somebody else around. People will then start showing up in your life who mirror that energy back to you, who see you and say, yes, her, or like, yes, him. I want them in my life, right? And you become the type of person who trusts their own inner voice and their own inner wisdom above everything else. And that is magnetism. That is the energy that magnetizes people, opportunities, and things to you, because everybody can feel that energy. And it is the most peaceful energy, and people gravitate towards it. So as an invitation, again, just pick 1 to maybe 2 promises this week. Keep it for at least 1 week, no matter what, and let your body start to feel what it's like to not be abandoned by you. Nothing can bring you peace but yourself. That is all I have for today. Have an amazing week ahead. I'm going to put some journaling prompts in the show notes if anybody wants to take this homework from this episode back for the week and continue thinking about this topic. If you haven't already and you enjoy the podcast, please consider taking a second to rate and review the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or leave a comment on Spotify. Really helps the show grow. If we're not connected on Instagram as well, the podcast account is the.well.path. Would love to connect with you guys there. I love hearing feedback on the episodes. I love hearing ideas for new episodes. Most importantly, have a fantastic, sparkly, wonderful week ahead. And I will see you guys in 2 weeks.